Yeah, the three.
Can't hear you.
Certain.
What the hell is going on here?
Quite nice. Thanks for taking their side of the next 2 hours. Just reading lots of powerful redeveloping the hospital system.
Folks could type in the chat if they can hear us.
Great. Okay, it looks like we're good to go. Well, first of all, let me welcome all of you, those who are in the room and the many who are joining us remotely this evening. My name is Pam Cooper-White. I'm the academic dean at Union Seminary, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is sponsored by the Bonhoeffer Stiftung, or Foundation. And I want to simply begin with my gratitude to the Stiftung, because this is an event that was founded in 1991. The Bonhoeffer Chair for the Promotion of Scholarship Research in the Field of Protestant Theology and Ethics. And the foundation also supports this very special Dietrich Bonhoeffer visiting lectureship. And this year, our lecturer is Dr. Jutta Kozlowski. And we have an annual exchange of lecturers between Union Theological Seminary here in New York, where this, where the foundation has established this lectureship, and also on alternate years in Germany. We had a hiatus, of course, because no one could do international travel due to the COVID pandemic. So we're especially grateful that this evening we were able to resume this pattern and have the Bonhoeffer annual lecture again this year. And for those of you who may be joining us from Germany, vielen Dank for your partnership.
Welcome, and my name is Ewan Cameron. I am here to welcome and introduce Dr. Kozlowski on behalf of the historical field at Union. I am a professor of Reformation Church history, and so have a certain calling to engage with the European traditions. And Dr. Kozlowski is our Dietrich Bonhoeffer visiting professor of church history, who, as Dean Cooper-White said, is the latest of a line of distinguished and creative scholars who come to us through the program. She is an ordained pastor in the Protestant Church of Hesse-Nassau and a formidably qualified scholar of theology with commitments in ecumenical theology, and also remarkable qualifications in that Dr. Kozlowski has studied Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox theology at both the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich and the Eberhard-Karls-Universität in Tübingen, and has obtained degree qualifications in each of those traditions. Her PhD dissertation was entitled The Unity of the Church in Ecumenical Discussion, Concrete Visions in the Catholic Protestants Dialogue, and was completed at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich. She has been conducting research and publications on ecumenism, Christian-Jewish dialogue, and on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, at the Faculty of Protestant Theology in the Johannes Gutenberg Universität in Mainz. She describes her key areas as ecumenical dialogue between the different major traditions of Christianity, interreligious encounter, and political commitment for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, all of which, I may say, are values that are enormously precious to us here at Union as well. After many years of very patient work, about which I expect we shall hear, Dr. Kozlowski discovered, stabilized, protected, and secured access to the very important memoir of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's youngest sister, Susanne, about whom I'm sure we will hear a little in the course of the lecture. And I want to thank Dr. Kozlowski particularly for her enormously generous engagement with all parts of the life of the seminary since her arrival here, not only teaching a course on Bonhoeffer and the anti-Nazi resistance, but also, from my personal point of view, being an enormously engaged and helpful auditor of my course on medieval heresy. So thank you for that. And the title of Dr. Kozlowski's talk is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Saint for Our Time. Dr. Kozlowski, welcome.
Thank you very much on my behalf of this invitation and the opportunity to deliver a public lecture here at Union about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I'm especially grateful for everybody who made the effort to join in person, but as well, very grateful for the large number of people who joined on Zoom. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a saint of our time. Let me first give you an outline of what will happen in the next 40 minutes. I will have 3 parts in my lecture. First, an introduction to current research, things which are new in Bonhoeffer scholarship, and I also use that part of my lecture to introduce myself and my specific approach and research a little bit more. In the second section, I want to speak about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and in the third, the saint of our time with a question mark. So keep this question mark in mind. It is an important part of the time. So I begin with part 1, current research. The book with Professor Cameron just mentioned, you can see the cover here. The title is in German, Aus dem Leben der Familie Bonhoeffer, the memoirs of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's youngest sister, Susanne. Born Bonhoeffer, married, dress. Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself, he was not able to write anything like autobiography. So his life ended quite suddenly in the middle of the course of his life. His dear friend, close friend Eberhard Bethge stepped in and he elaborated this vast and really brilliant biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But with this text, a new primary source is accessible, namely the memoirs of a very close relative, his youngest sister. She describes not only her own course of life, but the life and the political background of her whole family. The Bonhoeffer parents had 8 children, 4 sons, 4 daughters, and they really formed kind of a network, a close network. They supported each other in their opposition to the Nazi regime. So to have this text, these memoirs of Susanne, really sheds important light and new insights also on the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is quite a large volume. It has around 950 pages, so it's really an elaborate text, but one can navigate easily in the text because it's structured quite good. You have chapters about the leisures of the family or the religious life of the family, their opposition to the Nazi regime, how they lived in the First World War or Second World War. So you can really use it as a source to get an authentic voice of the Bonhoeffer family, including Dietrich. So after I happened to edit this book, I was the author of another book, much smaller, around 150 pages. This is like an extract of this vast book, trying to show what new insights about specifically Dietrich Bonhoeffer we can gain from Susanne's memoirs. Other follow-up projects emerged. This is the cover of a book which will be actually released next week. It's again from the family, from the Bonhoeffer family, in that case from the father of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Sylvester Tagebuch, meaning Sylvester diaries. He had the habit to make an entry in his diaries, not daily, but on one specific day of the year, namely the last day of the year, the last hour of this last day. So he would sit down kind of in a solemn moment and write down about the most important events concerning the larger family indeed. So who was born, who married, who died, who was elevated maybe as a professor, who was put down as a professor because the Nazis didn't allow it anymore, who was put in prison, who was sentenced to death, who was killed. And not only like a chronologist mentioning the events, but also commenting them. So this is, again, a very important new primary source material now made accessible. And the last example, I would like to point to this book. This is the cover of a book about Klaus Bonhoeffer. Klaus is the older brother of Dietrich, 5 years older than him. When we hear the name Bonhoeffer, people think immediately, oh, Dietrich, but hardly anyone knows that Klaus Bonhoeffer was also very active in the resistance movement, even and Dietrich. He was before Dietrich in this movement, and he was the one who convinced his younger brother to join. And he was also in prison. He was also killed by the Nazis. So I felt, instead of writing maybe, I don't know, 101st book about Dietrich, it would be just to write the first book about Klaus Bonhoeffer. This book is already finished, but it will be released next year only because the book publisher felt like it should be stretched out a little bit. So what is my focus, my specific approach in this type of work and research? I focus on the biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, more on the biography than on his theology. Why? Dietrich Bonhoeffer is really important, and when we engage in the discussion, people would often point out that the way he led his life is meaningful for them, an important example. So it seems to me that his biography is even more speaking to people nowadays than his theological thoughts. Of course, theology and biography are very closely intertwined in this case, but for me personally, I would say that his theology is a bit more conservative than what I would like to adhere to, especially his strong Christological approach, because I am engaged a lot in interreligious dialogue. I figure that we have other common grounds which are, in my opinion, maybe better ways to meet each other. So I kind of yeah, my focus is more research about the biography. And the biography, as you've already seen, not specifically focused on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I highlight the importance of his family as a supportive network in the resistance of the Nazi regime. And family network, I want to put a special focus to the role of its female members. Why? Because they have been neglected so much. I mean, this biography of Susanne, she wanted to become a writer throughout her whole life, and it is really a very brilliant and beautiful style of writing. She was such an able woman and but nobody ever really cared to publish her vast work. And this is true for other.
We're just going to switch the mic. People are saying they're hearing the outside noise.
Okay.
I'm just going to turn your mic on your computer. And then I'm going to okay, try now. Try now.
Hello? I think it's still low. I can't read German.
How about now? Can you start talking again?
Hello? Can people hear me better now?
Okay.
The IT team was working hard to improve the sound.
Okay, we're getting positive
Okay.
things.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, yeah, to highlight the role of the female members of the Bonhoeffer family. And actually, my next book project shall be a biography of Ursula Schleicher, the oldest of the 4 daughters the family had. In the course of the time, I was able to get really in close contact or even make friends with family members. I mean, the children and the grandchildren. So they have kept records and letters, and yeah, they kind of opened their private archives for me because they appreciated it a lot, that the focus broadens a little bit from this one very famous family member also to maybe Ursula, for example, who was also very important in the resistance movement to the Third Reich. So my specific approach, I focus on primary source material. I want to make it simply accessible so that other researchers can make use of it. I want to share it as the family members shared it with me freely. How am I doing it? I try to provide unabridged editions. This, I think it is important to give really the full account of what is there in order to use it as a primary source. And I deliver it with introductions and extensive annotations and commentaries so that the readers can more easily understand the context. And what is the result of this? I think in recent years, by acknowledging these new materials and perspectives, we can have a broader understanding of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I call this a biography versus a hagiography. So I don't mean to say that the one huge biography of Eberhard Bethge was a kind of an hagiography, but it happens sometimes that we try to highlight with special attention the positive aspects of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, and especially the work of Susanne, which I mentioned in the beginning. She really looks at him just as her brother. And if he was sometimes arrogant, she writes he was sometimes arrogant. She has no, I don't know, no special bias or interest to put him, I don't know, on a column like these column saints. So we have, when it comes to saints, what does make a person a saint in the church? We need a vita, we need a written record. And for that, we need a chronologist or somebody who writes it down. Or a polyphone voices, a number of voices who can add to a more complex image of that person. And I hope that this is happening more and more with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the other family members. This material is so far mainly accessible in German language. There are some extracts of it published in English, namely 2 articles, which I have pointed out here. But a project has already begun to translate Susanne's memoirs or parts of it in English. We already found actually a book publisher, Fortress Press, which is like the #1 for English Bonhoeffer publications. We have a translator. We are just looking for a little bit more funding, and I'm confident that we will manage to realize this project, because I think it is worth, in addition to the many scholarly secondary literature which continues to emerge, to also make available the primary sources which have newly been discovered. So this was part 1, some insights about new developments in Bonhoeffer research and how I try to collaborate with them. I'm now skipping to part 2, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I show you some images. The first one on the left side, this is one of the portals of Westminster Abbey, and there's a stone masonry of 20 martyrs of the 20th century. And among one of them, here on the right-hand side, enlarged, you can see Dietrich Bonhoeffer with his characteristic glasses and almost bare head, having a book, eventually the Bible, in his hand. So this shows how famous he became, to be really selected among one of the 20 martyrs of the 20th century at that famous place at Westminster Abbey. Here we have a photo of him, one of the first photographies. I think he was 4 years old, very light blonde hair. Actually, if you would see not only the face, but the whole person, you would discover he wears a dress. He looks really like a girl. He was dressed like a girl, but that was the fashion at that time. Here we can see Dietrich Bonhoeffer a little bit older, or how he might have looked actually between 1930 when he came to Union for the first time, and 1939 when he was here for the second time. I see a confident person leaning back, dressed kind of wealthy and looking at us. And here, this is the very last photography which exists of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We see him walking in the Tegel prison courtyard. They were allowed twice a day for 30 minutes to walk around in that courtyard, accompanied by a watchman. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the second person from the right. And you can notice that he's not wearing these clothes with stripes or whatsoever. So he's still wearing his suit. But well, if you really take a close look, you can see that this suit has become kind of too big for him because he was malnourished almost for 1.5 years at that time. The focus for this lecture actually is not particularly to give you an outline of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's biography, because many people eventually already have quite some knowledge about that, but just for us to be on the same page, to know whom are we speaking about all together. And because we have many people also in the chat, I just want briefly to highlight the most important stations of his life. He was born in the year 1906 in Breslau, a city which now belongs to Poland. When he was 6 years of age, his family moved to Berlin. And again, 4 years later, they moved to a very spacious villa in Grunewald neighborhood. It was the professor's neighborhood, also many Jewish people living there. They moved in kind of in the middle of World War I. And yeah, the house is still standing. I have visited it. You can tell that they were a very well-off family. Education played a major role for them. Culture, they went to so many concerts and theater plays, but not just did they watch it, but they produced it themselves. So they would write pieces and make their own dresses, and I don't know, have show it in their huge living room, receive many guests and celebrate great parties. So yeah, among their guests were many famous politicians or scientists. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer really had a lot of inspirations in his early childhood already. When he was 14 in World War I, his second oldest brother died, and he decided that he wants to become a theologian. The father was not so very happy with that, but he accepted. Nobody ever questioned it. The way disapproval would be communicated in the Bonhoeffer family was to raise the eyebrow a tiny little bit. This was already, everybody knew what that meant. But later, his father wrote to Dietrich, well, when I thought it's maybe a bit too boring for you to become a pastor, you have gifts to have more influential positions, I think I was wrong, because you had to go through so many struggles as a pastor in the confessing church. So he began his theological studies in the year 1923 in Tübingen. Tübingen is where the well-beloved grandmother Julie Bonhoeffer lived, and where it was kind of a tradition for the male members of the family to go to the alma mater of Karl Bonhoeffer and to spend their first semester over there. And then he returned to Berlin and finished his studies. He was quite quickly, so at this point of his life, it looks as if he would pursue a rather straightforward career. He became a vicar in Barcelona, so he had the chance to go to another country in Europe in an expatriate congregation, German congregation, for 1 year. Then he returned to Berlin shortly, and then again he could go abroad with a scholarship here at Union Theological College in New York. This happened in the year 1930 to 1931. After he returned, he was adjunct lecturer and student pastor in Berlin. What happened next? In the year 1933, there was this seizure of power. Germany shifted from a democracy to a dictatorship. And Bonhoeffer's reaction at first was to withdraw. So he applied and was appointed as a pastor in London. So again, he had an experience abroad. But he was called back 2 years later to become a director of a seminary of the Confessing Church in Finkenwalde. The Confessing Church was that part of the Protestant church in Germany which tried not to compromise too much, at least with the Nazi regime. This went on for 2 years. Then this seminary was closed by the Gestapo, but they continued for another 2 years this work in the underground. They had to stop also because World War II broke out in 1939. So really hardly young men were left whom they could train. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was waiting for his call to the military service. At that point in his life, he was determined if he would receive that call, he would be a conscientious objector. And there was a death penalty for that. So his friends and family really tried to get him out, and they made an arrangement for him to go back to Union Theological Seminary. He stayed here only for 3 weeks because he felt a strong calling in his conscience that he needs to go back. And so he did. He was looking for what can I do now? Where can I live? Where can I serve? He really started to become a continuous migrant. He had no home really anymore. And he was working as a double agent. Officially, he was working for the Secret Service and under this cover in the political resistance against Hitler. So you can feel that at this point, his life became really complicated and delicate.
Speak a little louder.
Oh, yes, thank you. So on the 5th of April, 1943, he was arrested and brought to the investigation prison in Berlin-Tegel. He never left the prison again. In the beginning of 1945, he was transferred to various other places and concentration camps. And on the 9th of April, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging. On the same day, his brother-in-law, Hans von Donani, was murdered. And just 2 weeks later, his brother, Klaus Bonhoeffer, and his another brother-in-law, Rüdiger Schleicher. They were, both these men again together, killed, while the Russian troops have already entered Berlin. So this is really only like the skeleton of his biography. If I say to you that I'm so fascinated by his biography, you can hardly tell from this skeleton, from these rough dates, but even these rough dates tell something about that. He was traveling to different countries, so kind of cosmopolitan. He was rather broad-minded. He was a pastor, not only a theologian, plus very politically engaged. And he was willing to wage his life for his convictions. So even in this short outline, we can already discover some important elements. which might be the reason why even, I would say, growing number of people as time passes by understand Bonhoeffer as a kind of saint. This is the reason why I gave my lecture this title, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a saint for our time. So if we speak of a saint, immediately the question would arise, what do we mean by a saint? There are different conceptions and understandings in Christian theology, depending on the denomination. There are some issues where Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox Christians would quite agree with each other, and some other issues where you can really tell why we have different churches and denominations. And I would say the concept of saints is one of the aspects where views differ indeed. So in the Catholic Church, there's really a formal procedure of canonization. A saint, well, you can say it in a vernacular language. Well, if you're kind to me, you're like a saint. But if you want to use it as a terminus technicus in Catholic theology, it is not a deliberate decision, but it's a decision of the Church itself, a procedure of canonization. And they apply certain criteria for this, which is the holiness of a person. So what does holiness mean? Actually, it does not mean, in the first place, moral sinlessness, but it has been conceived by many people in that way. And even in terms of, the criteria for canonization still include definitely a moral life of that person, at least after his or her conversion. If it was like a before and after with the huge contrast, that might also be fine, but at least after conversion, a saint should be a very good example for us as a Christian. Also important for the Catholic understanding, one can only be declared formally as a saint after death, and as kind of confirmation that this person is really elevated to the realm of God himself, is that miracles have occurred after people have prayed to this saint, asked him or her for intercession. The Catholic Church is really quite thorough with their examination of these miracles. They try to avoid all kinds of superstitions connected to that. Also, when they declare somebody as a saint, it means that the believers are allowed to access this particular person, ask him or her for intercession. And in some centuries, there was even a concept of substitution. So not only the saint would pray for me if I'm in distress, but the good works of this saint can somehow make up for my shortcomings. They call this concept thesaurus ecclesia, so the treasury of the church, not a material treasury, but in terms of good works. So this is really something which Protestant theology would never want to accept, because we also have this understanding of vicarious making up for things, that this is exclusively related to Jesus and not kind of shared among human beings. And of course, saints are human beings also in the Catholic understanding. One last aspect I'd like to recall is many saints, especially in the ancient church, were actually martyrs. So if somebody really died for his faith, this definitely can be an important aspect to be acknowledged as a saint. Why? Because the saint basically tries to follow Jesus, to live in Jesus's image. And Jesus, as we know, went to the cross. He also died or was killed for his religious beliefs. So if the martyr suffers this same fate, he's very close to Jesus and really a follower. Who is a saint in the Protestant Church? Basically, we have here a rejection of this Catholic concept, which emerged right at the beginning of the Reformation. Besides of this rejection of the Catholic concept, we can also find kind of a neglection of the subject of having saints altogether. So hagiology would not show up as a tract in Protestant dogmatics as it does in Catholic dogmatics. So it happened a little bit like it happened with, for example, monasticism, something which the reformers found, and instead of really reforming the concept, they rather forgot about that concept for many centuries. Because Protestant theology really focuses on the justification of the sinner instead of an idea of sinlessness of any Christian or any person. And Jesus is considered as the exclusive intermediate to God, not the Virgin Mary or any other saints. But we Protestants, that is at least the statement I would like to make, we cannot completely get away from the idea of saints, because we have that in the Bible as well. So if we read the Bible, we encounter some ideas about saints. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a concept of holiness attached to God or the temple, certain objects and spaces, the land, the people of Israel. And besides of this broad concept of holiness, we have also specific holy men and women, prophets, ecstatics or ascetics, like the Nazir, people who didn't drink wine or who fasted in special ways or didn't cut their hair. In the Greek Bible, we find kind of an universalization of this concept. It begins with the beginning of the church on Pentecost, the pouring out of the Spirit, of the Holy Spirit, conceived as a fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel. So in the last days, everybody shall prophesy. So this also led to the idea that all who belong to the church are somehow saints. We find this idea, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, in the greeting of Paul to this parish, to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ, called to be saints. Or in the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 19. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God. Why were these first Christians considered as saints? And in that case, not in kind of a hierarchy, one is a saint and the other is not, but all together. If you belong to Christ or to this communion, you are a saint. There was this concept of sanctorium communio, so a communion of the saints, because they had also part in the communion in bread and wine. So by their attachment to the body and blood of Christ, to Christ himself, they participated in his sanctity, and they shared all this status of belonging to this Sanctorium Communio. Sanctorium Communio is also the title of the very first work which Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, namely his dissertation. It was not published at his time, but now, of course, we find it in the collected works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It is not possible for reasons of time to dwell longer on this. I just wanted to mention it, that it was important for Dietrich Bonhoeffer to reflect and to think about saints and sanctity right from the beginning. This has also to do with his ecumenical broad-mindedness, because he encountered in London the Anglican Church and in Rome the Catholic Church. He was very open and curious somehow to try to find out what's the good in their ideas and how can we authentically try to learn from that and to welcome it in our own theology. I want to highlight just one very famous text of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which is a letter to his friend Eberhard Bethge from the 21st of July, 1944. This is a remarkable date because it's just one day after the failure of the last and huge plot against Hitler from 20th of July. This didn't work out, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood we are finished. The resistance movement is finished, and now only losing the World War II and losing so many more lives will end this Nazi regime. So what did he write in this letter? I just wonder whether anybody here in this room, maybe somebody who has not such a strange foreign accent in English, would like to read for us. Will that still be heard if the person reads out loud? Will people in the Zoom meeting be able to hear it?
If they talk loudly,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm willing to do it.
great.
All
Yes.
right. In the last few years, I have come to know and understand more and more the profound this worldliness of Christianity. The Christian is not a homo religious, but simply a human being. In the same way that Jesus was a human being, I think Luther lived in this kind of this worldliness. I remember a conversation I had 13 years ago in America with a young French pastor. We had simply asked ourselves what we really wanted to do with our lives. And he said, I want to become a saint. And I think it's possible that he did become one. This impressed me very much at the time.
This conversation actually have taken place here at Union, eventually in this room, quite for sure in this building. It was his friend Lasserre, whom he encountered when he was here during his first visit in 1930. And yeah, he still recalls this conversation, which was so meaningful for him at that crucial day when he was in prison. He continues, and maybe somebody would continue to read for us. Yeah.
Nevertheless, I disagreed with him, saying something like, I want to learn to have faith. For a long time, I did not understand the depth of this antithesis. I thought I myself could learn to have faith by trying to live something like a saintly life. I suppose I wrote discipleship at the end of this path. Today, I clearly see the dangers of that book, though I still stand by it. Later on, I discovered, and I'm still discovering to this day, that one only learns to have faith by living in the full this worldliness of life. If one has completely renounced making something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner, or a church leader, a so-called priestly figure, a just or an unjust person, a sick or a healthy person, then one throws oneself completely into the arms of God. And this is what I call this worldliness, living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously no longer one's own sufferings, but rather the suffering of God in the world.
So if we reflect on Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a saint, it's important to understand what was a saint for Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And yeah, just to highlight it again. He stressed the profound this worldliness of Christianity, and he wanted to learn to have faith, to renounce of making something of oneself, to throw oneself completely into the arms of God, to live fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. And if we do this, that was Dietrich Bonhoeffer's idea, then we take seriously the suffering of God in the world. I think especially this last aspect, to live fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities resonates with many people today, because we figure how complex our life is indeed. We don't want to have simple answers from a saint. So again, who is a saint for us? Whether we are Protestant or Catholic or don't identify with any specific church or denomination, examples are important and necessary for us. They have a function. They help us to identify ourselves and to find orientation. So even in the secular world, people would put posters of football stars or popular leaders or celebrities on their walls, and try to look up to other people as examples. I want to make tonight in my lecture this statement that we as Protestants need to reappropriate a concept of saints in Protestant theology, and we need to rediscover a genuine evangelical understanding of sanctity. So this doesn't mean to just copy it from the Catholic Church. Probably it doesn't also mean to completely invent it new, or to reject everything which is already there in tradition, but to assess it and try to develop our own understanding of that. And I want to state, and we can discuss that, I'm happy to hear your views about that. I want to state that Dietrich Bonhoeffer can show us a way how to responsibly fulfill this task in two ways. First of all, by his theology, part of this I have laid out in this important quotation. And secondly, because he himself can be regarded as a model for us, kind of a modern saint in Protestant Christianity. So we have both aspects, the theology and the biography, working together in the attempt to develop a Protestant understanding of a saint with reference to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Of course, there are also dangers and challenges, especially when it comes to this Bonhoeffer veneration, which we witness, kitsch and insipidity, for example, devotionalia, or I don't know, as a pastor, sometimes I feel uncomfortable by singing time and again this famous song or poem of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, By Powers of God, when maybe we don't really have understood its context properly. This is kind of not so harmful, more dangerous even is this idealization. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a hero of faith, he counteracts it himself with this famous poem, Who Am I? There's the danger of moralization. So again, what I have mentioned in the beginning of writing or reading his life in the fashion of a hagiography. Instead, we should look for a critical encounter with his legacy. And there's a danger of appropriation. So, for example, a right-wing allegiance with Bonhoeffer, or just recently with all the COVID restrictions in Germany, conspiracy theorists, they part of them, they claimed Bonhoeffer because we want to fight against a suppressive government. When we think about dangers and challenges, this might also refer to us here at Union. I think we cannot completely or easily appropriate Dietrich Bonhoeffer here, because he was also quite critical about Union, and after he left, he developed. He was continuously developing and changing his views. So his theology in Finkenwalde somehow resonated with what he learned here, but it was also different. So we should just, we are not obliged to take everything from him. This is not what he would have wanted us to do. So to conclude, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a saint for our time, ? What would it mean for us? In my understanding, for me personally at least, the most important characteristic of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, what I really, where he really is an example for me, is his attitude to learn how to have faith. So to be constantly underway, to question oneself, and to have the courage to restart. Well, maybe not every day or week, but after some years, maybe to undergo another conversion. Also most meaningful for me to learn how to have faith. So it's not only about being on our way, but being on our way of faith. He was a resistance activist, not just like this, but as a theologian and pastor. So this is, as a Christian, relevant for me. I like very much about Dietrich Bonhoeffer his courage to speak out for minority positions. I think he was kind of a lateral thinker. What do I mean by that? Well, when he was studying in Berlin and everybody was keen about Bultmann, he said, well, how about this other guy, Karl Barth? I will go there and travel and I will meet with him. So when he was at Union and everybody was going just across the street to Riverside, he said, well, how about the Black people over here? I want to go to Harlem and go to this church. And when he was in the Confessing Church in Germany and everybody said, well, we should fight against Hitler to protect our church's rights, he said, no, we should protect the rights of Jewish people. So he, even in this Confessing Church, again, he was articulating minority votes. This is the reason why many people say, well, he was so brilliant. If he wouldn't have been killed, he would have had a brilliant career. My personal opinion, but it's, again, maybe it's also a lateral opinion, maybe this wouldn't have been the case because he was kind of a troublemaker. He was not streamlining in any institution. I don't know what would have happened with him had he lived longer. So just as for me, at least, the most important takeaway from this lecture, living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. I just wanted to invite you, because now we will have a discussion and an encounter, but if you want to touch more about some of these aspects, you would also have an opportunity in April and May. There's a series of 3 discussions also on Zoom and in person in Riverside Church. So whenever you have questions which cannot be really discussed in depth today, maybe you would want to come back.
But let's thank Jutta for her lecture and then we can open it up.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, let's see you. There we go.
Now you are famous.
It looks like there's no questions in the chat, but there are questions in the room.
Sure. So we had a whole bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to get through them. So a question came in is, what would Dietrich Bonhoeffer's approach as saint be to Putin's invasion in Ukraine?
As saint
Yes.
or as model or example
As a
for us.
saint,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, of course, I don't know the answer, but here we enter the realm of speculation. But I'm happy to do that because I love also speculative discussions and theology. I think for me, besides of being a theologian and maybe in some ways a saint, he was kind of a prophet, I would say, somebody who was ahead of his time with his insights. This is why he was marginalized with his opinions. Often that happens with prophets. They say things which only become more evident to the majority of the people later on. So I don't know whether at this point of time he would say much more than, I am so sorry for what happened and we need to help the people. But I believe, that's just my personal guess, 4 or 5 weeks ago or 10 years ago, he might have spoken out more distinctively, saying, well, shouldn't we call for a council of peace? This is what he did 1932. So again, before it was too late, or before Hitler has seized power, maybe he would have said, is it really a good idea to go further and further east with the NATO? This will probably bring a war. So how can we be actively peacemakers? We also must understand that not in all points of his life he was a pacifist in such a way that he would have said we must never employ weapons to fight. He said, I do not want to employ weapons to fight for Hitler, but he was okay with employing weapons to fight against Hitler. Actually, he said he's praying for the Allied forces and their air raids to be successful. So he's kind of praying for his own home country to lose this war. Yeah, these are my thoughts.
All right. So we have a question from.
Can I ask?
Oh, sir. Yeah.
Do you know if he wrote anything or we have any evidence of his opinion about Chamberlain's doctrine of appeasement earlier on with Hitler?
Yeah, he was very critical about that. Yeah, he didn't. He was disappointed. Yeah. Actually, even before, when this appeasement policy was employed in the Czech crisis, 1938, we know well about Klaus Bonhoeffer, at least, that he came home crying, and he said, I'm crying because we have no war, because they avoid this war. And I foresee he was also maybe a prophetic figure. At least he was clear about that. I foresee this means Hitler will take it all. You cannot appease a dictator like him.
So we have a question from Archbishop Richard Sorrentino. Says, Bonhoeffer added to our understanding of our theology of the cross. How much was he influenced by the Diet of Regensburg?
By the what of Regensburg?
The Diet.
Diet of Regensburg.
I think the Archbishop is referring to those ecumenical conversations in 1541
Okay.
between liberal Catholics and Lutherans in Germany,
Yeah. Okay.
as an attempt to arrive at some sort of ecumenical resolution of the issues of the Reformation.
Okay.
I hope I'm not.
We're so glad you're here.
Yes. Oh, yes. Especially to help also with the language. Could you read then the first part of that question again, please?
Sure. Okay. Let me find the question. So Bonhoeffer added to our understanding of our theology of the cross. how much was he influenced by,
Mhm.
The Diet of Frankenstein.
there we go.
Well, I know of no particular reference he ever made to this document, but definitely he was influenced a lot by the theology of the cross, and this Christological approach was central for him, and he was very Lutheran in his theology altogether. So,
Can you just tell us anything you want about the Finkenwald Seminary, anything that comes to mind?
oh yes, it was a very humble and tiny space. We cannot imagine it humble enough. It was, they had no beds or tables when they arrived. They really, like even the Franciscan friars, they went around in the neighborhood singing songs and creating poems like, do you have some cutlery for us or some plates? So they were really leading a simple life over there. He tried to design it a little bit according to a monastery, because also when he was in London, he was very interested about monastic life, and he has visited by purpose Anglican monasteries to study it. He even wanted to broaden his knowledge about common life by going to an ashram and by visiting Gandhi in India, a plan which could not be realized at that time, but it shows how important this issue was for Bonhoeffer. And he had kind of a rigid order of the day. We know it pretty clear from many documents which have prevailed, like waking up early in the morning, having half an hour of meditation, having the meals, of course, together, and sometimes even in silence, the meals. So they had like a lectio divina. And then he was teaching. I mean, if we just see, he was professor at the seminary. We think maybe of Union Theological Seminary and a distinguished professor, but I mean, he was the one and only person over there, about 20 young men, no women around. And so he was teaching everything, including ping pong and swimming, and they shared the cooking together. Actually, his students disputed again and again his rigidity, because in Lutheran theology we call that Werkgerechtigkeit. So whenever kind of pious activities are sort of prescribed, traditionally Lutherans would get nervous, and he had to fight these fights again and again, because the seminarians only stayed there for 6 months, and then the next generation would arrive. So it was really a community for time. Only some from the first group, he asked them to stay with him so that they can more easily, I don't know, pass on some traditions which they develop to the next course. Does that help a little bit, or to get an idea?
Do you know the book Life Together?
Gemeinsames Leben.
Yeah.
There he describes, after he really needed to leave the place, and even the clandestine place couldn't be continued because of World War II. So 1939, when it was quite fresh, still all his impressions, he wrote a book, really trying to keep a record, actually, quite precisely as a model, as a handbook for if I might die, so that it will not be forgotten what we have tried out. It was a quite innovative project. And it happened indeed with this book, or with this concept of life together, that after World War II, with this book, a number of communities in the Protestant church emerged. So kind of a reappropriation of communal life in Protestant theology. And Bonhoeffer and his experiment, plus the book documenting it, was essential.
question. In English, his famed book is called The Cost of Discipleship. And then the German version was called Discipleship. But I understand in German, it's Nachfolge, which is not discipleship, it's follow after or succession or kind of a different idea than discipleship. And I wonder, there's no
Yeah.
English equivalent? Is that-
Yeah, well, this book comes in English under two titles, The Cost of Discipleship and Discipleship, but it's the same content, the same book. I think they just, the cost of, they skipped later on and just now it is just called Discipleship.
But in German,
What-
it's succession or follow after.
Nachfolge means to follow the footsteps of Jesus. I personally think it's pretty close to the idea of discipleship, but I don't know whether a better translation, well, we call the followers of Jesus, we also call them his disciples. So this is why the noun discipleship emerged as translation of the title. But it's basically about the Sermon of the Mount. So this was another lateral thinking of Bonhoeffer. When in the Lutheran tradition for, I don't know, for 150 years, nobody ever cared about the Sermon of the Mount, or actually about Jesus' teaching altogether, or what Jesus did during his lifetime, besides of healing people. Bonhoeffer said, why not look at Matthew chapter 5 to 7? We need to integrate it in our theology as well. We need to have a kind of positive approach to good works and deeds. So he highlighted in his lectures at Finkenwalde the Sermon of the Mount, and his students have asked him, kind of like with Life Together, Professor, write it down. I want to take this book with me if I'm called to war, if I'm sitting in this, how you call these pitches where the soldiers trench. Yeah. And maybe I have time to read and I need some good stuff to read to survive spiritually. So he wrote this book.
And what can you tell us about the Van Horn sisters, Kathy Van Horn and Maria Van Horn?
If you could just speak up asking the question, the folks are saying they can't hear.
The two governesses, did they play a role in his upbringing? Kathy Van Horn.
Actually, I'm not quite familiar. Who is Kathy Ben Horn?
There were two pietists, like babysitters to help raise the family.
Ah, Maria Horn
Maria Horn.
and Käthe Horn. Yes,
Horn,
thank
yes.
you. Well, they were very important, like it happened with many well-off families at that time. The mother was quite busy. She had these 8 children, plus at the maximum 14 servants. So she had to look after this huge house, and actually looking after the children, especially when they were small. This was Maria Horn, and her nickname was Hörnchen. So even more important for Susanne in this book, which I recommended at the beginning, The Memoirs of Susanne, she devoted a whole chapter to Hörnchen. So she has our ancestors, my father, my mother, my siblings, my Hörnchen. And she says, well, to be honest, I loved her more than my mother, but I felt so ashamed for that. Yeah, well, she was the one who sang with them lullabies and prayed every evening their Moravian Brethren tradition prayers. And yeah, she was important. Käthe was her younger sister, and she arrived in that family later on to assist the mother in teaching. They had, again, lateral thinking. Is that an English term? Or I'm glad. They practiced it also as a family. So when actually homeschooling was not practiced at that time in Berlin or in Germany anymore, but Paula Bonhoeffer, she was a professional teacher, so she decided before I give my children to school for 3 years, so basically the time of elementary school, I will teach them at home. So that it is more interesting, I will also invite friends of them who are of the same age. So I will establish classes, and yeah, they arranged a room, and she did the whole teaching. And then when she had so many children and so many things to do, she invited Käthe Horn to be her teaching assistant as in her homeschooling endeavors. And then later on, Käthe, she immigrated to Cuba. And when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was here at Union for the recess of Christmas, 1929 to 1930, they visited in Cuba this Käthe Horn sister.
So I'm going to jump to, we have a lot of questions coming in from the chat. Could you elaborate on how the perspectives of women around Bonhoeffer affect our picture of his saintliness?
I would say the women add this perspective of having a saint with flesh and blood, an accessible saint, a saint who laughs with them, who plays with them, who eats with them. So the perspective of, well, if we compare, for example, the biography of Eberhard Bethge, he focuses really on Dietrich Bonhoeffer as the theologian and the thinker, and maybe the resistance worker or the politician, or in church politics, the scholar. If we compare that to Susanne's description of Dietrich, he focuses on him as the human being, my brother, with his good and bad sides. So for me, at least, he became much more accessible, because what if a saint is really somewhere up in the stars? I feel discouraged. How could I ever catch up with him? But after I have read Susanne's description of Dietrich, I felt like, wow, this is like Dietrich described himself in this short poem, Who Am I? I am not a hero of faith, but I am, like in this quotation, I am constantly searching, questioning, stumbling, and getting up again.
So we have a question. Bonhoeffer was influenced by the civil rights struggles of Blacks in America as a result of his work at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem and his visit to Howard University with a Union classmate. How might his example as saint be instructive today in this atmosphere of culture wars and attempts to suppress American history related to race?
This is also a very important question, and I think indeed in this challenge, we can quite literally try to take him as a model. I mean, leaving one's own comfort zone. He was almost the only white person, I think, who was regularly attending the church, Abyssinian Baptist Church, and not only attending as a visitor, but he became a lay minister. He carried out Sunday school for children over there. So I would pick from that also, he was persevering. He just didn't do it symbolically or for one Sunday whatsoever, but he stuck on this throughout his whole period of time. So he also left his comfort zone in terms of his concepts of and understandings, so that poverty and social justice or injustice is an issue. Indeed, it wasn't obvious for him in the beginning, because his background is so bourgeois. He was willing to learn and to change his mind and to encounter with people from different social backgrounds and to abide with them.
So we have somebody who is sharing what makes them so passionate about studying the life and legacy of Bonhoeffer. And they asked, where does your passion for studying and researching the life and legacy of Bonhoeffer emanate from?
Mm.
Is there a particular experience, introduction to somebody, reading that really set you down this path?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I've shortly mentioned it already, but I can elaborate a little bit more on it. For me, the most relevant aspect, or where I can attach myself to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is his questioning and taking lateral positions. And especially I find it in the last stage of his life, in Letters and Papers of Prison. I think I'm not alone with this view, but most people, I think, if they choose just one book of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, most people would pick Letters and Papers of Prison. For me, it's fascinating how he said, or he wrote, listen, I think I want to start at the beginning once more. I feel I need to question almost everything I've thought and written before. I want to be, I don't know, stay inquiring or flexible like him, with him, concerning my own theology. And this, I make the shift, so I also question his theology, like my own, like anyone's, with him. But I don't know, this person, did she or he also reveal in the chat what is relevant for her about Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Because I really want to encourage you. This doesn't need to be like a Q and
Sure.
you can really also share your comments and your
I can
insights.
read off exact. So
Mhm.
it's someone named Jan Carlson Bull.
Mhm.
My initial encounter with Bonhoeffer was during a 1962-1963 seminar in moral philosophy with the late Dr. Charles Mully at the American University of Beirut, where I was a junior study abroad student, and my paper was on the ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a paper I still have. As a Unitarian Universalist minister now, that encounter continues to resonate.
Wow, thank you very much for reading this out. This adds really to the voices we have in this room. It's so beautiful that somebody in 1963 had this encounter and still keeps the paper, and that it happened in Beirut, in Lebanon. So this also shows that Dietrich Bonhoeffer speaks to people in various contexts.
Let me pull one more here that I think is interesting in terms of the question about women and his relationship with women. This comes from Matt Jones. Do you think Dietrich's response to Susanna's unhappy romantic relationship with Greta von Dohnanyi troubles or shifts or offers an internal critique of central tenets of his own ethics or mandates? For example, his upholding of patriarchy as the divinely commanded order of relationships between men and women.
Well, just to give a little bit background, Greta von Dohnanyi was one young woman in this bunch of teenagers or young adults in this Grunewald neighborhood. They lived really close to each other. They were pretty much from the same cultural background, and they spent for some years such a great time with each other. And it happened that marriages occurred from that. So the oldest brother of Dietrich, with the name Karl Friedrich, married Grete von Dohnanyi, and the brother of Grete, Hans, was married by one of the sisters of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Dietrich's sister Susanne was for some years in love, as she describes, with Grete. An unhappy love, because she was just younger, and Grete, I don't know, was again in love with somebody else, not with Karl Friedrich. So as it happens with the young people. So, and she wanted to commit suicide at the Susanne. Well, I don't mean to say that she was prepared actually to carry it out, but she had this kind of juvenile depressions, and she was crying, and Dietrich comforted her, and I think he said something like, well, don't make an end to your life. You are far too young, and it would be really, you are just too lazy, I think. You would like to lie in the coffin just to sleep and not be active. So yeah, we need you here on earth, something like this. But so he was Susanne, she said, this comforted me very much, that he kind of took it with a sense of humor. So she said, well, indeed, lying in a coffin would be far too boring for me, and maybe I was just afraid of life at this young age. So he encouraged me to go on. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer's relationship to women, well, this is a great question. It allows me to elaborate with this example. Yeah, what does it mean to take him as a model or saint? As I said, I don't buy anything from him, and you probably wouldn't do the same. So was he very egalitarian, or would we still consider his behavior to women as a model for us? I would say not really. He was in that aspect not so much a prophet ahead of his time, in my understanding. In that aspect, he was more influenced by the thinking of his time. So when he corresponded in prison with his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, we have, for example, his letters. Oh, you are reading Rilke. This is not the right book for you. You should read something else. He's much too romantic. And then he wrote to Eberhard, well, these young women nowadays, they are so autonomous and just read whatever they like, and then they pick the wrong books. But I think I will be able to rectify this once we have married. So, but I think Maria, she was a very bright woman. She studied mathematics later on, and she went to America for good, and she had a career in this really newly emerging computer industry. It would have been interesting what this saintly couple, well, Maria and Dietrich, how they would have figured out to deal with their patriarchal heritage and to develop, to a certain degree or not, equal relationship. We don't know about that because they had no chance to live that out.
We're just about at time, and I'd like to just ask you, what do you think Bonhoeffer would have thought of our considering him as a saint? What would he have said back to us?
Very interesting question. I think most people who are considered saints don't like that idea themselves. It's almost, they have to do that. It's part of their, if they really know themselves, again, I want to mention this poem, Who Am I? They understand I am not a saint. And there's also kind of a classic saying, if one becomes a great saint, he becomes a very great sinner, meaning he understands more and more because he's so self-critical and no more hypocritical towards himself or herself. He understands more and more, I am not a saint. The same is true for Martin Luther. He said, well, people run after me, but who is this Martin Luther? People are really mad. I should rather never have been born instead of people calling themselves Lutherans. So if we have churches dedicated to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, no, I don't think he would have liked the idea. He would have maybe for justice and or Church of the Cross would have been, or Church of Christ would have been the more appropriate name in his understanding, because what does a saint want to do in a Christian context? He wants to follow Jesus, so he doesn't want people to point out to him specifically, but in such a way as I try to conceive it, a saint, not a person whom we don't question, but a saint who inspires us to model our life as disciples. With this idea, he would have been more happy, I guess. And also that people read his books and actually try to take him as an example and to live life together as he prescribed, or that they read discipleship and study it and try to take serious his thoughts plus question his thoughts. That's the best way of taking him as a saint in his own idea, I think.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for those in the room, and for the many of you who are online. We want to thank Dr. Kozlowski one more time for her wonderful lecture, and thank again the Bonhoeffer Stiftung for the support of these kinds of scholarly conversations. Thank you all and have a good evening. Thank you.